This has got to be one of the strangest Vostoks I've seen to date. It's the Amfibia Reef GMT, and it's Amfibia with an F, not a P, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, when most people think of Vostok, they think of the classic Soviet-style amphibias and kommandierskis, but they forget there's a whole other side to Vostok, one with a bit more modern and contemporary style designs. And I'm not talking about Vostok Europe, that's this whole other thing. What I'm talking about are the kommandierski automatics and the Amfibia divers that's spelled Amfibia with an F. I know it's confusing because they share the same name, but trust me, they're completely different watches. They do share the same movements, but that's just about it. Now, different is the perfect way to describe the Amfibia Reef GMT, as it's a dual bezel compressor-style GMT. And even stranger, this is not the first dual bezel compressor-style GMT I've run across this year. That would be the infamous Cresticle TX1, which has now just been shortened to Crestic. But while I was working on that review, I actually got contacted by a subscriber who wanted to know what I thought about this new Vostok, which just happened to be the same type of watch. And more importantly, it corrected a few of the issues I thought the TX1 had. So I kind of took this as a sign that I should get one, but Marinome just happened to be out of stock, but I decided to get one as soon as it was available. And here we are. So as usual, let's start off by taking a look at the specs. And here we're looking at a watch that's 41mm wide. Specifically, when measuring it, I found it to be more like 41¼ without the crown, and 46.2 width. And I think when you pair that with a 47.5mm lug-to-lug, you overall get a nice smaller platform, and I personally found this one rather comfortable to wear. However, like a lot of Vostoks, it is a tad tall at 15mm. I think it goes without saying that I'd prefer it to be a little thinner, but here you are talking about a compressor-style GMT, so there's just a lot more going on that's stuffed under that flat mineral crystal. Now, at this size, it's much more common to see a 22mm lug width, but here they decided to go with a 20. I usually prefer the feel of a 20mm strap, but I think some of you might think it looks a little bit off proportionally, at least compared to the overall size of the case. The Reef GMT also has a really solid, well-made feel to it. I think it's just over 100 grams with its leather strap, which I think is a bit on the heavier side, but I think it's just enough weight that you always remember it's there, but not much more than that. The case is reported to be stainless, as is the caseback and the crowns. And overall, I think the finishing is pretty good for the price. The edges underneath the case and inside the lugs are a little sharp, but not too bad. Like a lot of Vostoks, the overall look here is a bit utilitarian and kind of tool-like, where it just primarily keeps your eyes focused on the outer bezel and the dial. The sides here are highly polished, while the top has a brushed finish. Although there is a bit of a faux chamfered edge that's sort of integrated into those lugs, where the polished area comes halfway up. It's a small thing, but I think it's a nice touch. The rear of the caseback has a circular brushing, and I think you can see a little bit of an awkward transition where the polished edge just abruptly stops, which is more apparent on the left side. Now remember that this isn't your typical Soviet-style amphibia. It's more contemporary in its design, and I think the normal screw-down caseback is one of your first indications of that, which is then followed up by unidirectional bezel with a black aluminum insert, which is a bit different than your typical bidirectional amphibia. The exterior bezel on the Reef GMT is 120 click, and I think the action is pretty good with a really great audible click to it. There's also minimal backplay, and it almost feels like it's spring-loaded, as when you let go of the bezel, it springs back just a little bit to the rightest-most position within each click. On the right, you have dual screw-down crowns. The one of the three is signed with the Amfibia logo, and that one controls the movement, while the unsigned one at the fore controls the internal bezel. Now, first off, this is not a true GMT. It's more what I like to call an original or a classic GMT, where the hour hand and the GMT hand are slave to each other, and you can't adjust either of them independently, which is just like all the other Vostok GMTs I've looked at. And just like those other Vostoks, there's no quick set feature for the date. In order to advance it, you just have to move the hour hand past midnight. Yet unlike those other Vostoks, this one doesn't have the infamous floppy crown, and that's going to be a bonus for some. Now, as I said, the crown at the fore operates the internal bezel, and I think it operates exactly as it should. Once unscrewed, you can freely rotate it left or right, to whatever the second time zone you want to track. The action of the internal bezel is nice and smooth, and it's really easy to set it exactly where you want it. I've had some other compressor-style watches that you really have to push the crown in order to disengage the mechanism, and that can make setting it perfectly just a little bit tricky, as it tends to rotate a little as you screw it back in. And this is also the first compressor-style watch I've seen with a fully lumed bezel, which I think is really cool, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. There is some bad news, however, and just like my Alpinist that I recently reviewed, the bezel doesn't perfectly align with the dial. It's easy to see this as you look down at the bezel and the date window, as it doesn't quite line up right. It's just a little bit off, and if you look at the gap between the bezel and the indices at the 3 and the 9, you can see that the gap is much smaller near the 9. So I think the dial is just a little bit off center. It's not a lot, and honestly you don't really notice it unless you really start focusing in on these finer details. But I thought it was worth mentioning because I did go into detail with that Alpinist, and I know some get really bothered by some of these finer details. Although here, I do think it's an easier pill to swallow, as it's 1/5 the price of the Alpinist. When I first saw the dual bezel setup on the Crestic, I thought its use was going to be a bit limited, and therefore kind of gimmicky, which it still sort of is, but I am warming up to it seeing it a second time. And especially in this configuration, where the 24-hour bezel is the internal one. Now at present, there are 2 colorways. You have this black one and a really good looking blue. It's kind of a tough choice between the 2, but the reason I went with the black one is that I thought the black date wheel integrated better in with the black dial, versus the white date wheel on the blue version. Now they both have this off-yellow internal bezel, and I'm really not a fan of this color. It's just a little bit too plasticky looking. But I think it does make up for it by being fully lumed. The dial itself is a flat charcoal black coloring, with an oversized 12 at the top, but the rest of the plied indices are dashes and dots. There's also a white painted chapter ring just beyond the indices and before the bezel. Each of the indices has a small metallic frame before you get to the white lume center, which I think gives it just a small glint of light as you move it around, and it helps highlight those indices against the black backdrop. And overall, you can't get much more contrast than a black and white setup, so this is really easy to read with its chalkboard-like appearance. The GMT hand is a large extended white arrow, but the hour and minute are silver swords with white centers, as well as you have a lollipop second hand sweeping around. The hour hand looks a little stubby, at least compared to the minute and the GMT hand, but it's not too bad. And overall the hands look really good. You also have the Amfibia logo painted at the top and Reef and 200 meters at the bottom. Not to mention the cutout with the black date wheel, and I think that blends in nicely here. Just like the other F-based Amfibia I saw, this one does have a Made in Russia tag at the very bottom, which I think is worth pointing out that it's actually in English as opposed to what you'd normally get with an Amfibia, which I think might tell you that they're more attempting to market this to an international audience rather than a local. The Reef GMT is definitely not a flashy diver, but one that's more rugged and tool-like, with just a really cool, unique design. It really doesn't look anything like your standard Amfibia, but the overall dial layout is still cohesive with the rest of the Reef line. As a whole, I do think the dial looks a little bit crowded, but so do most compressor-style divers, so it's not much different on that front. But here you're not only getting one that looks good, but also has the functionality of a GMT. And I think that makes this an excellent travel watch. Not only is it a 200-meter diver, but it's also going to be fairly inexpensive to replace if something accidentally happens to it. But let's move on to the Lume, and this is something I always find frustrating with Vostoks. Here, initially it does look great, and I really love that loomed internal bezel, but it really just doesn't have any staying power. Going into a comparison, I knew it wasn't going to stand up to a turtle, but I was more interested in how it stood up to a regular Amfibia. So that's what I used in the comparison test, along with another compressor-style watch. Now, one thing here that's really disappointing is the lume pip on the external bezel. That's pretty much the first thing to fade out. And if you were actually going to use this for diving, that lume pip is one of the last things you want to fade out. But watching it a little bit longer, you can see that it fades out just a little bit before the regular Amfibia. So I'd say it's almost, but not quite as good as that. Which is kind of disappointing, but maybe not surprising for the price. But regardless of that, I really wish Vostok would up their game here. Although it is worth pointing out that that Dan Henry diver that was also in the comparison didn't last much longer. Generally, I've been pretty disappointed with the Lume compressor style watches, with that Crestic watch being one of the only exceptions. Now, movement-wise, we have a Vostok caliber 2426, and just like other Vostoks, it should be a low-beat 19,800 beats per hour movement, as well as one having a 30-hour power reserve and hand winding, but no hacking. And unfortunately, just like other Vostoks I've run across, the accuracy with this one is a bit lacking, as I found it to gain about 36 seconds a day. Now, it's worth pointing out that on Marinome's website, they do list the specs as being between -20 and plus 60 seconds a day. So technically, it is within spec, but practically, that just really sucks. I mean, gaining about 40 seconds a day makes the watch almost worthless. And this is another aspect that I really wish Vostok would get in order. I'm starting to think that they realize that their fans are willing to put up with this kind of stuff, so they keep doing it. As most Vostok fans are generally tinkerers, and they're not afraid to get their hands dirty on what would be an easy fix. So I think they're willing to put up with this, just because otherwise they're getting a lot for their money. But at the same time, this exact thing is the main reason that I'm really hesitant to wholeheartedly recommend Vostok to a new collector, as they may not have the confidence or the desire to open up the back of their watch and play with the movement. Let alone someone who justifiably thinks that they really shouldn't have to fix something that's new. So I think it'd do a lot for their brand if they at least tried to get their spec the same as Seiko, which still isn't that great, but at least it's better than Vostok. But let's move on to the strap. And here the GMT Reef comes with this black leather rally type strap. And I have to say it's pretty good and really comfortable, and that's kind of surprising coming from a Vostok. I don't think it's the best leather, and it may be just a little bit thin, but it looks great and just has a nice texture, not to mention feels really comfortable on the wrist. It's still a little tall, but it's not really something you feel. It never feels top heavy. It's just something you visually see. But overall, with that shorter lug to lug, it just hugs your wrists nicely. And I think this is easily something you could wear all day. Normally with a Vostok, the strap is one of the first things I swap out. But here, I think I'd actually leave this one on. I really like it. And that's something I wouldn't normally say about Vostok. Although one last thing to consider is that this is leather on a diver, which I know drives some people crazy, and generally I have no problem with that style-wise. I mean, I do it all the time. But I think it's a little odd for it to come that way, as you can't get that leather strap wet. So I'd recommend getting a second strap that's much more waterproof, and just swap it on depending on what activities you're planning. Overall, it's a pretty cool, unique watch, but it's one that shares the typical Vostok shortcomings, which is accuracy and lackluster lume. Now, accuracy is something you can deal with if you know how to regulate it yourself, but it does make me rather hesitant to recommend one of these to a new collector. As for lume, there's really nothing you can do about it other than just accept it, and hope that at some point in the future Vostok decides to use something better, or just a lot more of it. Now, when it comes to divers, there's a lot of watches in this sub $200 category, and if you're looking for just a diver, I'd probably point you towards an Orient. But where this watch gets interesting is that GMT functionality. Most automatic GMTs start around $500 and go up from there. Although it's worth pointing out that those all have more sophisticated movements, where you can independently adjust either the GMT or hour hand to track a third time zone, where here they're just slave to each other, so you can only track 2 time zones. Yet even with that, it's pretty rare to find an automatic GMT less than $500, and all the ones I've seen are Vostoks. So like those, I think this is a pretty good value. And just like those other Vostoks, I think this could be a great choice for the ultimate inexpensive travel watch, especially if you're going somewhere tropical and plan on getting in the water. And like those other Vostoks, they're all a bit different and unique in their own way. But this one takes that on a whole other level. You have something very cool, very different, yet tough and highly functional. But let me know what you think about the Amfibia Reef GMT down below, or if you can think of any other Vostoks I should take a look at. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.